Each year, millions of dollars are spent on the eradication and control of invasive plant and animal species in California. Pests and diseases such as the glassy-winged sharpshooter, the red imported fire ant, and sudden oak death are capturing today's headlines and the interest of University of California scientists. At a recent Invasive Species Symposium held at the University of California Davis campus, scientists shared their latest findings through case studies. In the wake of new regulatory policies, UC scientists discussed new strategies to manage and control invasive species that have already established themselves in the state, and ways to prevent the threat of new invaders on the horizon.
Taxifolia. This is dubbed the killer alga, also the devil seaweed, and it was identified in Southern California 2 summers ago. It is listed as a noxious weed in the United States, and the World Conservation Union put it on its list of the 100 worst invasive species in the world. The alga's native habitat is in the tropics. It likes warm water. It produces upright photosynthetic blades, and this entire seaweed is a single giant unicell that can be meters long. It's a very unusual organism. It propagates clonally along a stolon that looks like a strawberry runner, and is attached to substrata, be it soft sediments or rocks, by root-like rhizoids. Today what I'd like to do is talk a little about the biology and ecology of Caluerpa invasions, and then give you some history of the management to date in Southern California, and then reflect a little on the lessons I think at least I've learned from the invasion in Southern California. Caluerpa taxifolia was identified outside of its native habitat for the first time in 1984. A French scientist, Alex Maynes, found a small patch of Caluerpa right outside the Monaco Aquarium. And he was quite concerned about this because he knew how fast Caluerpa could propagate, and he watched it spread. He also knew it was non-native. He notified the scientific community, and he also notified the European governments. And the issue became very hotly politicized, publicized, and polarized because it was inferred that the Monaco Aquarium, which was keeping a strain of Caluerpa taxifolia, had actually released the seaweed into the Mediterranean Sea. The Monaco Aquarium had in turn received its strain from the Stuttgart Aquarium in Germany. In the intervening time, Caluerpa spread from Monaco into France and Spain, down through Italy, and up into the cold waters of the Adriatic. Remember, this is a tropical seaweed. Most recently, it jumped across to North Africa. The concern in Europe is that Caluerpa taxifolia can displace native habitats. Here you see it displacing a native seagrass bed. Seagrasses are very ecologically important habitats and communities. They provide lots of trophic support. They provide a lot of habitat structure. In the United States, they're protected under the Clean Water Act. Not every habitat that Caluerpa invaded did it displace native seaweed or seagrass communities, but it did so with enough frequency that the scientific consensus is that Caluerpa is one bad weed. Now, some of the attributes that make it such a formidable invader are that it has an incredible rate of vegetative propagation. This is a marker, and from this marker to the meristem tip on the stolon is a single day's growth. So in native habitats, Caluerpa species can grow up to 8 centimeters per day per meristem, and the density of meristems in one of the invaded sites in Southern California is way too high. Another attribute is that Caluerpa is really quite a Houdini. It recovers rapidly from any disturbance, be it fragmentation or burial. So this is a bleached, upright blade. It had been covered by sediment, hence the bleaching, and within a few days' time it produced new upright blades. This is characteristic of the genus Caluerpa, that any part that's fragmented or buried can rapidly regenerate a new frond, a new plant. So 2 summers ago, environmental consultants identified Caluerpa taxifolia in this lagoon in San Diego County. And in the same summer, we recognized that Caluerpa had also invaded a harbor and a restricted area of the harbor in Huntington Harbor in Orange County near Los Angeles. The habitat that Caluerpa invaded in Southern California was an eelgrass bed, a native seagrass. And in Southern California, eelgrass beds are important habitats for California lobster. They're nursery areas for California halibut. And brant geese depend on eating eelgrass along the Pacific Flyway, including in San Diego. So there was quite a concern about finding Caluerpa taxifolia in these habitats. Now we can infer with fair certainty how Caluerpa was introduced to Huntington Harbor and Agua Hedionda. These strains in Southern California are not different than the invasive Mediterranean strain, which originated in public aquaria. We know this based on DNA fingerprinting. Steve Burry and his graduate student Susan Fritsch conducted a survey of aquarium stores in Southern California, and half of those stores carry up to a total of 16 taxa of Caluerpa. So we are again inferring, based on the DNA evidence and the evidence that people are keeping Caluerpa in their aquaria in Southern California, that somebody accidentally or deliberately dumped the contents of their aquarium into these 2 lagoons. People love to keep Caluerpa in their aquaria because it's beautiful, it grows prolifically, and it's very cheap. Often it's traded over the internet, and in some cases aquarium stores or wholesalers, retailers give it away free with aquarium tune-ups. So faced with this invasion in Southern California, we looked to Europe to see what we could learn from how they dealt or didn't deal with the invasion there. In Europe, they did not make attempts to control Caluerpa, and hence that large spread throughout the whole region. I've been involved in reviewing some of the literature, and when the invasion happened in Southern California, I did as thorough a review of the literature as I could. And most of the studies from the Mediterranean were based in the laboratory, and it was very difficult to extrapolate any useful data to the Southern California situation. We were very concerned about the impacts on the native communities, and we looked to Europe again for studies of the impacts on the fish and invertebrate communities there. Well, unfortunately those studies, and there are a few of them, suffer from a lack of replication. So there is not a single unequivocal result that demonstrates that Caluerpa taxifolia had a negative impact on fish and invertebrate communities. However, thanks to some field studies done by Giulia Ceccarelli in Italy, we do know that Caluerpa taxifolia in the Mediterranean has a negative impact on seagrass communities. Giulia did these experiments by manipulating the densities of both Caluerpa and the seagrasses in several studies in several different areas. So the evidence is pretty good about the negative impacts. Now, we really wanted to know what the Europeans had attempted in terms of treatment and control. And there are very few data on control attempts. There are a few gray literature publications, but mostly the information is passed mouth-to-mouth or verbally. What you ask is, well, did you try this, or did you have any success? And the response is, oh no, don't try that, it didn't work. But you try to say, well, why did it work? And nobody can really give you a good answer. So despite a lot of laboratory studies and a lot of attention in the Mediterranean, we felt we were in a situation where we really didn't have very good scientific information or even great anecdotal information about what to do with this invasion. So now, 2 years later in Southern California, what do we know about the science of this Caluerpa invasion? And I think we all recognize how difficult it is to predict what an invasive species will do in a new habitat. European scientists did not predict that Caluerpa would survive in the chilly waters of Croatia. And in Southern California, it was actually scientists who discovered Caluerpa in Huntington Harbor before the environmental consultants did. And they assumed that Caluerpa would not overwinter and did very little notification of any management authority. So basically, the situation now is there are still few accessible data from the Southern California invasion. The environmental consultants doing the eradication are collecting data on a basically ad hoc basis without much of a plan, and only bits and pieces of that data are available even to the management team. In this case, scientists were not encouraged to participate in data collection, and I personally, as a scientist who did her doctorate on Caluerpa, was discouraged from collecting data in the field during the eradication. So after 6 months after the eradication, after a lot of effort, I was finally granted permission to collect some data. And Ted Grossholtz and I were able to do a few dives in January in Huntington Harbor. And we could only collect some very preliminary observations on the biomass, the density, and the morphology of Caluerpa taxifolia in Southern California. Here are some of those data. We certainly found Caluerpa in Huntington Harbor. And we also found a native seagrass, Rupia. Now, this seagrass, the presence of this seagrass, had not been reported by the environmental consultants, and the managers had not mentioned if they knew that this seagrass was there. Again, the seagrass is protected under the Clean Water Act, so that anything that we do to that seagrass must be mitigated by law. We also found Caluerpa and the seagrass Rupia growing in mixed patches. And you see that in the mixed patch, Rupia, the seagrass, has a much lower biomass than when it grows alone. So although these data are very few and preliminary, you might consider this as some support for the hypothesis that Caluerpa taxifolia might have negative effects on native seagrasses in Southern California. So I use these data to make a comparison to Caluerpa taxifolia in other invaded sites. And what was surprising to me, even though I had been following the literature, is that I could really use only 5 total studies. Often these studies lacked a sample size or an estimate of variance, so you can't really make good comparisons. So based on that, with that caveat, I didn't see anything particularly unusual about the invasive Caluerpa in Southern California compared to invasive Caluerpa in Europe. And now there's another region of invasion in Australia. And what was really striking is that we have virtually no data on Caluerpa taxifolia in native habitats. So we can't do a good analysis of what are the attributes that make this European, the Mediterranean aquarium strain invasive. Does it have special attributes? Was it truly selected while it was grown in a public aquaria? So there are still a lot of very interesting scientific questions to be addressed. So given that we don't know too much about the science, let me move on to the management history. I want to tell you a little about the eradication effort, something about the steps being taken to prevent future invasions in California, and then tell you that there's an important education and outreach program that I won't talk about, but you can talk to Ted Grossholtz about this. So as soon as Caluerpa was identified, an eradication campaign was mounted immediately. And I can't emphasize what a success this was for managers, that they could get together and they could proceed immediately on trying to eradicate the seaweed. Eradication was deemed feasible feasible because it was restricted, the invasion was restricted to 2 sites, each of which was restricted geographically. And also very critical to mounting this eradication was the will of the managers. They were just going to do it, and they did it. And had they not done that, we'd probably, well, I'm pretty certain that most of these lagoons would be covered by Caluerpa today. Another key factor in mounting the eradication was, where are you going to get the money? Well, it turns out that Caluerpa had invaded the subtidal land owned by a private power company. And then that power company provided the seed money to start the eradications while the agencies had to scramble to find funding to sustain the effort. Another important biological feature that made eradication feasible is that there are no apparent means for long-distance dispersal of Caluerpa other than by human vectors. So the treatment that's being used is to kill it with bleach. And tarps, black opaque tarps, are secured over the eelgrass and the Caluerpa. And then liquid chlorine is injected by divers under these tarps. And then the tarps are left in place in perpetuity, perhaps. In Huntington Harbor, liquid chlorine couldn't be applied, so solid pucks of chlorine, such as you use in your swimming pool, are inserted under the tarps and are placed on the Caluerpa. So that's the eradication strategy. And I want to talk a little about the authority for management, because I think the Caluerpa case makes a point that it's really important to have the authority for management outlined ahead of time in some sort of response plan for any invasive species we think we want to manage. I think this is an attempt in the National Invasive Species Management Plan. So in 1999, Caluerpa was listed as a noxious weed in response to a petition by scientists who had been following this scenario in the Mediterranean. And just a year later, Caluerpa was discovered in California, and USDA transferred the lead to the local California Department of Food and Agriculture. And at this time, an ad hoc management committee called SCAT for Southern California Caluerpa Action Team was formed, and it was formed only because of the interest of federal, state, regional, and local managers, stakeholders, lawyers from the power company, and Ted Grosholtz and I serve as the academic members of this ad hoc committee. Because Food and Agriculture was busy with their own terrestrial invasive species, including the glassy-winged sharpshooter, and because they had no experience with the seaweed or the marine habitat, eventually they transferred the lead for SCAT, an ad hoc team, to the Regional Water Quality Control Board in San Diego with some help from Santa Ana Board. Now, the Regional Water Quality Control Boards are managing Caluerpa with sort of a quasi-regulatory status. They're using the EPA regulations for non-point sources of pollution and applying it to an invasive species. Now, because SCAT is managing the invasion but has no real authority, there's a lot of discussion that in the future the authority should switch to the California Department of Fish and Game. However, this has not yet happened. So the context for management of the Caluerpa invasion in California is the Marine Life Management Act. This legislation mandates that we must manage California's marine resources based on science, and that we should be taking an ecosystem and habitat approach, and that the tool recommended to implement science-based management is external scientific peer review. So we pay a lot of lip service to science-based management, but I think we all recognize that, at least in the case of Caluerpa, science is really important to help us figure out what's going to happen. Which ecosystems is Caluerpa going to affect even? We certainly know it's in bays. Will it reach the open coast? We need to know if eradication is truly effective, and if so, can we minimize the cost? We also really need to know how far this seaweed is going to spread so we can target surveillance efforts. So despite the context of the Marine Life Management Act and the value of such scientific information in justifying the costs that we've already incurred and to justify future actions, there are a lot of impediments to achieving science-based management. For example, how in the world do you make certain that science peer review is actually implemented early on? How do you involve research scientists in a management scenario, especially in an eradication scenario? How do we make certain that the eradication strategy that we decide on, very preliminary in the beginning, how do we make certain that that eradication strategy is truly effective? So there are a lot of reasons why we want to achieve science-based management, but there are a lot of challenges to doing it. Another challenge to management is how in the world are we going to prevent Caluerpa from being released into other lagoons in California? I do want to talk a little about the legislation that California passed just recently. So this is the original bill, and what I want to point out is that the state of California proposed legislation to ban Caluerpa at the level of the genus. And banning or listing Caluerpa at the genus level was based on scientific information. Even experts have a lot of trouble differentiating species of Caluerpa. It's one of the most morphologically plastic seaweeds known. This is the type morphology of Caluerpa taxifolia from Southern California. And Caluerpa is quite a shapeshifter. Right about here, the seaweed decided that it was going to become a different species. So the rest of this seaweed has the type morphology for this species. If this part had been buried and I had gone in the field and seen this, I would not, and again, I did my doctorate on this genus, I would have identified this as the wrong species. Now, we know it's taxifolia because we've done the DNA analysis. So I'm pointing out how very difficult it is to manage or list species of Caluerpa except at the genus level. Now, other Caluerpa species have become invasive. Caluerpa racemosa, shown here, this is the grape-like morphology, is a favored species in aquariums. And ironically enough, Caluerpa racemosa now is outcompeting Caluerpa taxifolia in areas of the Mediterranean. So a lot of the scientists have switched their studies from taxifolia to racemosa. Okay, if you do a risk assessment for the entire genus, we know that all species of Caluerpa propagate rapidly, they regenerate rapidly. Many species are grown in aquaria, they risk being selected, they risk being released. We know that experts can identify species with certainty. This creates quite an enforcement problem. And other species have been documented as invasive. So based on this, the scientific consensus is if you're going to regulate Caluerpa, do it at the level of the genus. This scientific recommendation was overturned when the legislation was amended to list just a few particular species of Caluerpa. And this amendment was in response to a vociferous outcry from the aquarium trade and the aquarium hobbyists. The freshman assembly member, in the first week after posting the bill, he received 300 letters from aquarium hobbyists, and in some cases, I think, from their mothers and their dogs. So this is the legislation we have right now, and Fish and Game is pulling out its hair trying to figure out how in the world to enforce this legislation. And I think that points out the importance of working with the aquarium trade. And Marshall Myers and I have had several conversations about this, and he just told me some very encouraging information about how the trade would like to help work with the managers to try to prevent the entry of Caluerpa into native waters. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to my reflections, and again, these are personal reflections on what we've learned by this Southern California invasion. Certainly, rapid response to a marine invasive species is possible. It's going to be expensive, it's going to be difficult, and managers have to exhibit the will to do it. That's very important. Centralized authority is also important. Having those lines of authority are critical for mounting that initial eradication effort. You have to get permits to eradicate. Also, you have to have the authority clear so you know where to find the money to do it. And lastly, usually it's going to be an environmental consultant who's doing the eradication. So the authority to tell the consultants what to do also has to be very clear. I think we also learned that unlike terrestrial approaches to eradication, the public views marine eradications a bit differently. The California public is exquisitely sensitized to their wetlands and to their coastal areas, and they want to know what collateral damage we're doing as we eradicate Caluerpa. We know now that enforcement, big surprise, is difficult if not impossible at the species level. And then if we go beyond the Caluerpa invasion to a larger perspective, which you've heard expressed earlier today, that we now know that the aquarium trade and aquaculture are also introducing non-native species to our waters. And these species have the potential to become invasive. So we really need to move or go beyond ballast water and give these other vectors for non-native species introductions a little more attention. On the science, we haven't learned very much at all about the biology and ecology of Caluerpa invasions, although I think by this time we could have learned a whole lot. I think in SCAT we recognized just recently that basically we've lost this opportunity in California because the eradication has been moving along so well. So as a scientist, what I hope we learn is that science and eradication should really proceed hand in hand. There's no reason why these two efforts aren't compatible. The argument that resources for eradication are siphoned away by research is rather spurious in my opinion, because often the pot for research money is different from that for eradication. And in this particular incident of the Caluerpa invasion, scientists volunteered their efforts and they were rebuffed. Second, you can't wait to do field research in an invasion because if the eradication is at all successful, there's not going to be anything to study. In the case of Caluerpa, I don't think the communities in the Mediterranean are different enough from those in Southern California that I'm not certain how much we could extrapolate if we followed the advice and went and studied Caluerpa as much as we wanted in the Mediterranean. So the research has to go hand in hand with the field effort. And scientists should not have authority to manage, but I think scientists have a responsibility to help management by providing critical information. So it's frustrating for me as a scientist to try to figure out how to articulate that research can actually complement the efforts of managers, and it can provide an important justification for management efforts. We are going to see Caluerpa taxifolia again in the United States. The conditions on the East Coast and the Gulf are just ripe for an invasion, and I'm pretty certain that we could see an invasion in the warmer bays of Oregon and even perhaps Washington. So when Caluerpa taxifolia does invade again, I hope that we will use it as an opportunity and a lesson learned that we can involve science early on and have a successful eradication and combine the two and learn a lot more about the biology of invasive species in the marine realm. Thank you.
What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about its introduction and primarily focus on its biology, talk about why it is such an invasive weed in California, and then some of the management strategies that we might use using that information. I see that most of the people here are from Sacramento, Davis area, and I suspect that most everybody here knows what Yellow Star Thistle looks like, and if you don't, you really need to get out more often. But Yellow Star Thistle originated probably in this area of Eastern Europe, Turkey, Italy, and that area, Turkestan, and probably migrated west as people moved west in Europe. So it's probably not originally native to Spain, but it is found in Spain now. But from Spain, it moved into South America. So it did not move directly into the United States from Europe. It's a European native, but didn't move directly into the United States. Moved in about the 1600s as the Spanish moved into South America and then began to conquer much of South America. In Chile then, and it moved into Chile primarily as a contaminant of alfalfa seed. Yellow Star Thistle, if you've seen the seed, I'll show you the seed a little later on. It's about the same size and shape as alfalfa seed. Alfalfa is not native to our area, so it came in as they brought in their horses and their alfalfa seed for feed for their animals. It was in only South America for another 100, 150 years or so. And then during the gold rush, Chileans sailed up the coast, landed in Oakland, brought their horses, brought their alfalfa seed, and of course brought their Yellow Star Thistle with them, and that's where it was first introduced into the United States. So it came sort of as an indirect route from Europe, not as a direct route. Since about 1903, however, Star Thistle has been introduced into the United States from a number of other sources. So it's increased genetic variability. It's come from Spain again, from France, Italy, and perhaps even Turkestan too. So it's come by other sources. If you look at the areas in which star thistle now occupies worldwide, this is the native range of it, at least part of this is a native range. But you'll also find, again in the United States, and actually not just in California, although probably 80 to 90% of the population is in California, 26 states in the United States have star thistle, including Florida and New York, although it's quite rare there, and while living in New York, I never once saw it. But it's also found in some of the Asian countries, and it's found in South America, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. There's sort of a pattern to this if you look at just the latitudes here. This is a Mediterranean plant, should be fairly obvious, and it occupies Mediterranean habitats and climates throughout the world, not just in its native range. Well, just to go a little bit into California, originally, California was primarily dominated by, at least our grasslands, we suspect, were dominated by native perennial grasses, bunch grasses, and other rhizomatous grasses. And the primary ones would be Nacella and Elamus and Lamus, and many other different types. And then when the Europeans moved out west, they introduced the annual grasses, not all of which are noxious and troublesome, all of which I would consider to be invasive, however, and primarily includes various species of bromus, wild oats, avena, which is wild oats, the wild barleys, hordeum, and ryegrass, the rye's, lolium. And then this occupied, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, a different zone within the soil profile, at least their roots occupied a different zone within the soil profile, leaving open that deep soil moisture for other plants to occupy, in which Yellow Star Thistle was the primary one that has occupied it. So we haven't directly, Star Thistle hasn't actually moved in and directly displaced native species. It's actually gone through this serial evolution where it's the annual grasses have displaced the native species, and then Star Thistle has then come along and beginning to displace some of the annual grasses. Well, I mentioned that was introduced first in 1850, but by about 1958, which is over 100 years later, it had only occupied about 1 million acres in California. And this is a study conducted by CDFA, and it's been conducted on a couple of different occasions. It was at this time that it began to increase very rapidly within the state, doubling within that 7-year period, and then again quadrupling by 1985, and again doubling about the year 2000. So it's estimated now that it probably occupies about 15 million acres of California. And just to give you an estimate, California is 101 million acres, so that's about 15% of the surface area of the state is occupied by star thistle, and clearly that makes it the most invasive of all our terrestrial invasive species, also aquatic if you include that. In California, this is a CDFA study completed in 1997. All the red, and it's hard to distinguish between the red and the orange here, but all of this area is the area occupied by star thistle within California. You'll notice there's not very much down in the mountainous areas or the desert regions. It just needs more water than's available down in Southern California. And then you get little pockets here where it doesn't survive up in the wetter northwestern regions of the state, and of course it doesn't survive on the top of Mount Shasta. But most of the rest of the state, particularly the Central Valley, the foothills, and the coastal ranges are dominated, at least with invasives, by yellow star thistle, a wide range. Now, of course, we're right in here in the central of yellow star thistle. And most of you probably are in areas where there's lots of yellow star thistle too. So it's extremely widespread within the state of California. Now, John Gerlach, who did his PhD with Kevin Rice, who's going to speak a little later on, did sort of an exhaustive study going through lots of literature to try to really figure out exactly how star thistle became established here and began to spread. And although there's a lot of material on this, I'll go through this because it's actually a rather interesting story. And he considered that the spread of star thistle in California occurred through multiple or many different processes. When it first came into the state, it was primarily a weed of alfalfa that was moved into the Marysville area or the Central Valley area, northern Central Valley area, and it was very localized. It was about in the 1870s. There wasn't a lot of equipment moving from place to place. A tractor hadn't even been developed. There was growers were not exchanging materials in hays long distances. So the infestations of star thistle really stayed relatively localized in the areas where alfalfa was grown, where it was a major problem. Then about from 1870 to 1905, there were some shifts in the way agriculture was done in California, more to some dry land wheat and barley, and then some irrigated alfalfa. And this is where yellow star thistle, also in about this area, a little bit more mechanization. So star thistle began to become established in other areas, and more roadsides began to be developed, and so there was more avenues and conduits for star thistle to move out. And so it expanded, but really slowly during this time period. About 1920 to 1940, John estimates that star thistle populations probably went down in the state. And the reason it went down in the state is because the tractor was developed in 1920. People were using tillage as a control strategy for a lot of different weeds, and that was probably suppressing a lot of star thistle. In addition, there was a lot more use of inorganic herbicides, boron and sodium chlorate and things like that along roadsides, which were then controlling the star thistle. So the population probably went down a little bit, but then by the 1930s, it made this shift over from an agricultural weed over into the foothill area, into the grazing systems. And from there is where it really began to explode within the state of California. So it became part of the grazing weed system within the state of California. And since that has really rapidly spread. And John considers that there are probably three major factors for its most recent spread since the 60s to now. One of these is the increase in our road building, and roads serve as the major conduit to move star thistle long distance, either through vehicles, tractors, various types of Caltrans equipment, things like that. Also through increased suburban development, people moving out, creating more, again, transportation, more movement of vehicles and things along roadsides out into the countryside, and an expansion in the ranching industry. So this has really led to this rapid expansion in the last 30 years of yellow star thistle in the state of California. And now pretty much any area that can be occupied by star thistle has access to it. Well, if you drive the state of California, like right now, anywhere in our major highways, this is what you'll see. You'll see star thistle essentially dominating the roadsides. And one of the reasons it does dominate our roadsides in California is because Caltrans manages for fire suppression along roadsides. And that means that they go out and they mow the roadsides as soon as the grasses begin to dry out. Well, at this state, star thistle is low growing. It's in a basal rosette. It gets more light penetration, and there's no subsequent control along those roadsides. So it becomes the dominant species along our roadsides. Why is that important? Is it such a big problem that star thistle is a roadside weed? Well, probably not if it's just within 3 or 4 feet of the roadside. But roadsides do serve as conduits for access of the plant to all other areas of the state. And in a study being conducted by CDFA and Caltrans, where they're mapping star thistle in the Sierra Nevada, they're finding that it is clearly roadsides that are the leading front of movement of star thistle from one area where it can occupy to the next area it can occupy. So it can move along roadsides even through forested areas until it gets to the next open land. So that's clearly the most important reason why it is spreading throughout the state. Although it used to be a problem in agricultural areas, hay production areas, it's not nearly as big of a problem today in these areas, but that's also probably a very important avenue for movement of star thistle 20, 30 years ago. This is a very old slide, is that it was used in hay, or it was not, it was contaminated in hay, and hay that had a lot of star thistle, like this hay probably does, you could probably guess, was not really high quality hay, and so it was oftentimes not used to feed animals. It was probably used for other sources, erosion control, baling hay along other things, and this, of course, is areas where the seeds fell out and it moved that way too. So there's another long-distance transport mechanism that created a problem. So it was not so much an agricultural problem. Where it's really a major problem in the state of California is in our rangelands and our grassland environments, where it can almost be up to about 80 to 90% of the total biomass of a particular area. And this was maybe even higher than this. We estimated 95% during the El Nino year. This photo happened to be taken in Calaveras County in 1998, El Nino, where it was about 90% of the total, 95% of the total vegetation. And this is where it's really a problem. And obviously, when you have 95% of your total vegetation as one particular species, you must be, by very definition, you must be depleting other species that are more desirable, including native plants. It does have toxic effects, but only very specifically on horses, where it causes a neurological problem called chewing disease, or the technical name, if you're a vet, is nigral palatal encephalomalacia, which is a lesion within the nigral palatal section of the brain of horses. It's irreversible and accumulates. It can cause poisoning. So it's interesting to note that probably 40 years ago, 30 years ago, this was a very common way in which horses were killed. But you rarely see a case of this today, despite the fact that yellow star thistle is much more common than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And the reason is because nearly every rancher in the state now knows what star thistle looks like and knows that it's poisonous. And so they take more precautionary measures to make sure their animals don't eat a lot of this. So you rarely see an example now of horses being poisoned by yellow star thistle. Okay, so that sort of gives you an introduction as to how it moved here and where it's located. And now I'd like to go into the biology of the plant, and hopefully when I get through the biology of the plant, you'll not only understand why it's so aggressive and so dominant in California, but you hopefully will also be able to see what some of its weaknesses are and how we might be able to take advantage of those weaknesses in developing management strategies for yellow star thistle. So if we're going to talk about that, let's start at the very beginning, when germination. Now, star thistle is a winter annual, and a winter annual, of course, means that it only survives 1 year. It germinates in the winter time, and unlike most other winter annuals which flower in the spring, this is a winter annual that acts like a better summer annual than any other summer annual that I know in California. So it's got the best of both worlds. The winter annual, the advantage of a winter annual is it can take advantage of seasonal moisture. The advantage of a summer annual is it has high light, rapid growth. So it can take advantage of both of these aspects. It germinates with the first rainfalls. Typically, this is the way you see it, though, in some of our heavily infested areas, not as little isolated seedlings, but as carpets of yellow star thistle seedlings. Well, most of our weed species, particularly our agricultural species, they germinate when the photoperiod is right. And that may be that they respond to a short day or a long day. And they'll usually germinate within a fairly narrow window of time, maybe a month or two, and then all your plants are up and germinated. Yellow star thistle does not have a photoperiod requirement. So it will germinate as long as it has two things, moisture and light. And so we looked at this, we planted actually 1,000 seed, and we monitored rainfall and germination in these boxes, pulling out every seedling that germinated. And what you can see here is that although a majority of the seedlings germinate with the first rainfall, you will always get some germination after any significant amount of rainfall event. And that'll go throughout the entire season. As soon as your rainfall ends, of course, you get no more germination. And then the second year, you get the same response. These are the same seeds. Why is that important? Well, because a lot of management strategies oftentimes target a particular time. So for example, if you went in and you say, well, I'm going to go in April, and I'm going to control all my star thistle using either tillage or using a post-emergent herbicide with no soil activity, you would control everything that had germinated, but you'd get a subsequent infestation with the very next rainfall. And I've seen areas where they've gone in and tilled Yellow Star Thistle to control it in a March or an April time period. Next rainfall, the only thing they have by the end of the year is Yellow Star Thistle, because even the grasses are not germinating after that period of time. So they get solid mats of Yellow Star Thistle in some of these areas. So this feature of its germination makes it a little bit more difficult to control than many of our other annual weed species. I mean, by the time you're in June here and May, your typical winter annuals, such as mustards, are all gone. They're still germinating. Star Thistle's still germinating. Well, when it germinates, it's a small little seedling, a little rosette, and it takes maybe 5 months for the plant to reach this size. And although you may look at that and say, well, it's really not growing very much in that 5-month period, it actually is growing quite a bit. It's just most of that growth is below ground. So you can see that, this says 24 days here, this says 56 days, you can't see that, but from 24 to 56 days, or a 2-month period, that root can be anywhere from 4 to 6 feet deep. And this is probably one of the key factors that allows it to survive in a Mediterranean climate, is the ability for it to produce a very deep root system that is capable of tapping into deep soil moisture rather than shallow soil moisture. Most annual grasses will have root systems about this deep, and of course as we stop getting rainfall now, the soil dries up, and these plants are going to senesce and die as the soil begins to dry. But star thistle is tapping into a much deeper root system. I mentioned, by the way, early on that those seeds are about the same size as alfalfa, and you can see them right in here. So this is probably one of the key factors leading to the survival of the plant. But there's some other factors too. As the plant begins to bolt, and it's long since bolted, it bolted in May of this year or late April. It's now about to go into flower. You'll see the foliage coloration change from more of a green color, a light green color, to a bluish green color. And that's because of the production of waxes and hairs. Now, any of you have gone out in a day like today and touched a white car, touched a black car, you know the difference. Black car is going to absorb more radiation, it's going to heat up. White car is going to reflect more radiation, it's going to be a lot cooler. This is a mechanism by which star thistle, and many desert plants have this mechanism too, can reflect a lot of light and not absorb too much heat. So it's a great mechanism for a plant living in a very hot, high intensive light environment. That's one mechanism by which it survives areas that have Mediterranean climate. Another mechanism is that it produces these baffles along the stem, much like a radiator. So whatever heat it does absorb, it can dissipate fairly quickly through these wing stems. So it's really well adapted to a very high light, very hot environment, hot summer environment with low summer rainfall or seasonal rainfall. But the feature I really want to discuss the most here in the next few minutes is its ability to utilize soil moisture. If you look at this as being soil depth, so here's the surface of the soil, well, 30 centimeters is 1 foot, so 2 feet, 3 feet, 4, 5 feet deep in the soil. This being the amount of soil moisture, and I'm comparing an annual grassland now with a perennial grassland, which is in this case wheatgrass, and Yellow Star Thistle. You can see that in an annual grassland there's more moisture at every depth within that soil. So this is, the farther you're out this way, the more moisture. Wheatgrass, which is the diamond right in here, occupies about the same, or uses about the same amount of moisture shallow, but then much less moisture deep. Star Thistle uses the most moisture both from shallow to deep in the soil profile. Let's look at this, and this is what we're talking about here. This is a perennial grass, this is an annual grass in this particular shot. Let's look at it from a little different perspective. This is taking 3 years of data, accumulating them all at every water depth, and just saying how much moisture does these 3 community types utilize over a period of time. So all the April measurements are lumped together, all the June measurements are lumped together. And what you can see here is that early in the season there's a lot more moisture in the soil. Obviously this is the rainy time of the year. And then in annual grasslands it depletes a little bit of moisture and it's going to go back up the next year. Wheatgrass is going to deplete more and go up, and star thistle is going to deplete the most by far compared to even a perennial grassland. If you total the amount of water that it's using, yellow star thistle is using about 16 centimeters of water over the period of a season. That's an average over 3 seasons. Wheatgrass, or the perennial grass, is using about 12, and annual grasslands are using about 10. So yellow star thistle is using about 6 centimeters more water, almost 3 inches more water per year than an annual grassland would use in a grassland environment. And let's break that out and look at it by year, because there's an interesting phenomena that happens here. Now, typically you replenish your soil moisture. This is, again, all depths, looking at total percentage water content over time. You're going to replenish your soil moisture during a rainy season, utilize it again, replenish it, utilize it, replenish it on a year basis. This is 4 years of data. When you're looking at wheatgrass, the same thing, except you'll notice that it's, of course, utilizing more moisture, and it's not necessarily always replenishing to the top, to the same level as annual grasses. And star thistle, the circles, will utilize a lot more. The interesting thing is this is in Wairika. This is up in Siskiyou County, and in last year, if you remember the Klamath River, all the issues they had up there with water use? Well, they didn't have almost any rainfall up there. They had about 40% of normal rainfall, which translated actually into almost no usable water, because the 40% of water came at really small increments and evaporated. So they almost had no usable moisture. So by the end of the year, or even after what was normally the rainy season, in the annual grassland, they still had about 20% water content, whereas in the yellow star thistle area, it was down to about 13%. They had very little moisture last year. You can imagine that if you were in an area and you were trying to undergo an oak restoration project, and you had star thistle in there you didn't pull out, you wouldn't see any survival in your oak seedlings. So this can have significant impact if you have a lot of yellow star thistle on many of your other native plants in that area, particularly perennials that you're trying to get established. So it just utilizes more moisture than most of the other perennials or annuals in that area. And that's one of the reasons why it survives so well in California, is it can outcompete things for moisture. If you just look at the total amount of water that yellow star thistle uses, more than an annual grassland, making the assumption that it's only really seriously infecting 1% of the state of California, it's using 8.3 billion gallons more water than an annual grassland would in the state of California. Water is a big issue in California. Well, after I tell you all the things that star thistle, why it's so competitive, there is one weakness that the plant has, and that is that it really does not tolerate shading. And this is a study done by Ben and Cindy Roche up in Washington. And even with a 30% reduction in light, you dramatically reduce both the seed production and the biomass of the plant. Under shaded conditions, or under, say, a canopy of an oak tree or a shrub, you'd be down in the 90% reduction. So you're just not going to see star thistle growing in shaded areas. It really has to be in a wide open or open full sunlight rangeland condition, an area like this. Okay, so what do we do about it? I mean, we have these enormous infestations of star thistle. How do we control it? Well, it's not a hard plant to control. There's lots of different ways in which we can control it, using all the different techniques that are usually available for most weeds. Mechanical techniques such as hand pulling and hoeing, weed whips, mowing, tillage, cultural techniques including grazing, prescribed burning, revegetation, which I showed a little bit of, biological control and chemical control. But of all of these techniques, there's only really 2 that give excellent control and almost 100% control, and that is prescribed burning and the use of the herbicide transline or chlorpyrrolid. And everything else gives suppression or partial control, and it can give excellent control under a certain set of conditions, but those 2 are the 2 that really give the best level of control. So prescribed burning, for example, is a risky way to go. This is the time to burn. You can see this is the high fire season. What you do is read the news. And, but it will give complete control. We utilize the fuel that's produced by the grasses and the remnant vegetation to carry a fire, but it'll give you 100% control. You hear a lot about the biocontrol agents. There's about 5 or 6 of them are out there. Mangosternus being one of the weevils that's out there. It and Urophora don't do a really good job because they produce little larvae that only eat out a few seeds. And as John discussed earlier, star thistle can produce between 50 and 100 million seed per acre. That's a lot. So you only eat out a few, you're not doing too well. Other weevils, such as a hairy weevil and the false peacock fly, are much better, but even at best, and we've monitored this for many years now, they only give you about 50% reduction in seed production. So you add in honeybees in there, they increase seed production by 50%. You put in the biocontrol agents, they eat that 50%. So now you're right back to where you started. Transline, or chlorpyrrolin, is incredibly effective. This is 1 ounce of acid equivalent. Imagine 1 ounce of a butter slice, just as 1/7 of a slice of butter spread out over an entire acre, and that's the level of control you get of Yellow Star Thistle, 100% control. This is an aerial application, that's our control. So it's incredibly effective on star thistle. It's more effective on star thistle than any other plant that I know. That's an extremely effective control strategy. Now the last 3 slides I want to show you is just to talk about how we do this when we put an integrated approach together, because in a rangeland condition is much different than an agricultural environment. In a rangeland or a wildland, grassland area, we're not looking for control of everything. We're looking for control of usually one thing and letting everything else survive. That's quite different from agriculture, where you only want one plant to survive and all the other weeds to die. So it's a little bit different, and so we're trying to look at how do you control Yellow Star Thistle, and as John mentioned, how do you get the desirable vegetation that you want to survive? We use different combinations here. BB means burn 2 years in a row. BT means burn first year, transline second year. TB the opposite, and TT is 2 years of transline, 1 year and a second year. And you can see this is 2 different sites that 2 years of transline is excellent against Yellow Star Thistle, and burn the first year followed by transline is also excellent against Yellow Star Thistle. But if you reverse that and you treat it with transline the first year and burn the second year, it was awful. And the reason is because burning stimulates germination of Yellow Star Thistle. So you don't want your burn to be your last treatment, but your first treatment, and then kill all of those seeds with Yellow Star. Burning itself is very good, but if you're in a really heavily infested area here and you burn all of your fuel the first year, there's nothing left but star thistle in year 2, and it's all green, there's no fuel to burn, so you get poor control. But we're not just managing against Yellow Star Thistle. If we're managing against a single species, we oftentimes go into what we call a weed treadmill, where we just swap one invasive weed for another invasive weed, and that next invasive weed in our rangelands is Medusa head. It's expanding rapidly, and it's even less desirable than Yellow Star Thistle. It has virtually very little forage potential. Even star thistle has some forage potential. So we have to look at these management strategies with the idea that we're not only trying to manage Yellow Star Thistle, but we're trying to manage for a community, and John emphasized this many times in his talk. So what we've done is we've looked at some of these strategies I just talked about and said, well, what do they do to our other undesirable plants? We looked at the whole community, but I'm only going to show you the undesirable plants, Medusa head and ripgut brome. So anybody around, anybody around here knows what this is. And you can see that although transline 2 years in a row is very effective on Yellow Star Thistle, it's not the way to control Medusa head or ripgut brome. They just don't get killed with these growth regulator herbicides. The way to go is to incorporate a burn. Now obviously a chlorpyrrolid followed by a burn does not control Yellow Star Thistle. So the only 2 options you have is 2 years of burning, assuming you get complete burns, or first year burn with second year chlorpyrrolid. So when we're trying to put together our management strategies for Yellow Star Thistle, we have to think in terms of entire community. What kind of strategies are not only going to control Yellow Star Thistle, but ultimately lead to the development of a desirable ecosystem and not just switch one weed problem to another. So when we think about controlling Yellow Star Thistle, that has to be in a broader context than simply thinking about a single species. Okay, I think I'll stop there, and if there's any questions, happy to address them.
Dedicated to serving people, the Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources strives to make life better for Californians in every corner of this fast-growing, ethnically diverse state. Call 1-800-994-8849 to request a free copy of our catalog, or point your browser to anrcatalog.ucdavis.edu for our complete online catalog.